Hi, I'm Mike Genung, and I'm just going to share my story today. So I grew up in the 70s in Southern California, and around my adolescent years, I was a big-time basketball fan. I was really into the Lakers out there, so I used to get Sports Illustrated magazine, and as it does every February, the swimsuit issue comes, and those images of those women with that looks on their face saying, "Come take me," that just lit a fire in me. And I figured out not long after that the local 7-Eleven didn't have a problem selling Playboy, Penthouse, Hustler to a minor. And so I caught fire with that, figured out what masturbation was. I had grown up in a Christian family, but by the time I hit my adolescent years, I kind of decided that God and church wasn't really going to fill my needs. I grew up with an overwhelming sense that I could never measure up and that I could not be loved as I was. And I didn't know how to break into church. I just had a hard time making friends, and so I just started walking away from the church. Another problem was that I was molested by a trusted Christian elder in my adolescent years. And people who have been abused, as I learned, have a miserable, it messes up their whole world. It distorted my perception of women. I was terrified of intimacy. At the same time, I had big-time anger problems. So I had all this emotional turmoil mess, and porn and lust and drugs and alcohol seemed to be the answer. So I threw myself into that full force. Well into my teen years, into my early 20s, there was the drugs and the partying, there was promiscuity, there was masturbation and porn through the whole time. Sex with prostitutes. Probably the worst part to me was when I had an affair with a married mother of 3 children, and played a major part in breaking up their marriage. And I was 23 years old. They ended up getting a divorce. And I just started getting depressed and realizing that my life was a mess. I was miserable. None of that stuff satisfied me. And one day, in fact it was a Sunday at dinner, I just felt this weird pull to go to church. I hadn't been into church for a long time. So I went to church alone. I was still living with that married mother at the time. And the preacher there was talking about the story of Abraham, right where God calls Abraham out of his father's land, Terah's land, and tells Abraham to leave. And then the pastor said, "There's some of you here who are in a land where you're not supposed to be in right now, and God is telling you to go." So I was like, wow, that sounds like me, because my life is a mess. So I began the process of breaking up the relationship with that woman, the wife of it was actually a friend at work. Or at least he was a friend until I did that. Once a sex enters a relationship, it becomes miserably hard to break it off, and it took me at least a good year to really break it off. I started getting into counseling, and to show how messed up I was, I started flirting with the counselor, who was a female, and can you imagine what would have happened if I'd have had an affair with a counselor? I mean, it would have messed my mind up even more. Fortunately, she started setting boundaries, and that stopped. But so I decided to clean my life up, started going to church, stopped dating girls who weren't Christians, quit all the drugs and the partying and the alcohol and all that. But what I could not and did not even know how to deal with was the porn and masturbation. It still really wasn't in the radar as being a serious issue with me. It was something I did for pleasure, and I did feel guilty and a bit shamed afterwards, but I didn't really see it as that big of a deal. And then I started dating Michelle, who was to become my wife. And as most naive young men think, I thought that getting married was going to fix my lust problem and that the porn would just go away. Well, we got married February of 1989, and what I soon discovered was that getting married exacerbates that lust problem, because what happens is we bring our coping mechanisms into the marriage. So if lust is your coping mechanism or lust is your habit, then you're going to bring all that into your marriage. And then it wasn't long before after we married that I started acting out again with porn. I think it was maybe 4 or 5 months, because then me and my wife would start fighting, I'd get mad, not know how to deal with it, and then I'd be gone again. So it wasn't long before I was starting to binge with porn every day into the first year of our marriage. Well, porn, lust never satisfies, and the more I did it, the emptier I got, and the more miserable I became. And for me, the worst part, even more than the guilt and the shame, was the emptiness. I always had this hollow, horrible feeling like there was a big hole in me, something was missing. And acting out with the porn made that worse. But the insanity is in the cycle, okay, so I feel horrible. What I'm going to do to fix it, I'm going to act out again, which makes me more miserable, which makes me more selfish, more proud, more bitter. And so Michelle was married to this guy who was really ugly inside, who was very critical and bitter. And what a lot of men don't realize is what this stuff does to you. We become an empty shell. We're miserable. Our relationship with the Lord sucks. We're miles away from God. And so I was all of this mess. And then a year and a half into our marriage, one day on a business trip to Dayton, Ohio, porn was suddenly not enough. It had become that empty to where I needed a bigger fix. And so that night in Dayton, I committed adultery with a prostitute on my wife. And I felt, I had done that before I got married, but this time I felt filthy and dirty like never before. I was overcome with guilt and shame, and 10 times more than anything I'd done with the porn. I had not really told her about that. And so 3 days after I committed adultery with the prostitute, I was still on the road. I couldn't stand the guilt anymore. And so I called Michelle from a hotel and told her what I did. And that is one of the worst days of my life. I will never forget her response. Most men, including myself, are totally dense to what they're doing to their wives. And they don't realize that what a woman does, she takes her heart, she gives it to her husband, she's bare and exposed and vulnerable. So when a man commits adultery with pornography or a person or a prostitute, he's taking a knife and running it through her heart. And I did not understand that in the least. So when I called Michelle and told her, she just broke down sobbing and crying. I had never heard her cry like that before. And when I heard her sob that deeply, I knew that this wasn't just, oh, it hurt me and we're going to move on. I knew I had rocked her to her core. And that this wasn't something that was going to be over in a minute. But my marriage was in danger because I didn't know if she was recovering. I didn't even know how to recover. I started going to SA groups. I saw that I needed to get help. And I remember asking one guy from the group, how long is this whole healing the marriage thing going to take? I figured he was going to tell me just a few months. Well, he came back and said it took him years for his marriage to heal, and I couldn't believe it. I had no idea what I was in for. My wife, she would go from rage to just crying her eyes out in a moment, and I didn't understand what was going on. But that is part of the process that they have to go through for healing. They cannot stop that process. And one of the dumbest things a man can do is say, why can't you get over this? Because this isn't something they can just get over. So I learned that what I needed to do was listen to my wife, walk with her, and be patient with her. And whatever she was going through, I needed to just walk with her and listen and to the best part of my ability, not try to defend myself, because I could not, and defending myself just made it worse. Because I'm the one that hurt her, so how can you defend yourself when you're the one that hurt her? Well, our marriage over a period of months started to heal. I I got into a 12-step program, and for the first time in my life, I started sharing in front of a group of guys all the messes in my life, particularly with sexual sin. And I had avoided having to tell anybody of what I was going through for years, but it was awesome just to be able to go in and not have to be the good Christian or put on the big mask or try and be a poser. Faking it really sucks. There's a lot of people in the church who fake it, and I was one of those, where they try and pretend there's something they're not. And the great thing about support groups is you can go on and go in there and just be a mess, and guys can show you what grace looks like, Jesus with skin on. So I went a year and a half without acting out with porn, and then I fell. And then I went 3 years without acting out with porn and masturbation, and then I fell. And in spite of all this time, I was going to counseling, I was going to groups, I was reading books. Every morning I was reading the Bible, and I was praying. I was still empty. That emptiness never was resolved. The groups, going to the group and being accountable was a great thing for staying out of isolation and dumping the shame, but something else had to happen for me to find what I was looking for. And I didn't even know what I was looking for. Well, after those 4.5 years, I just started flopping and stumbling. And so I fell maybe once a month, maybe once every 3 months, until the fall of 1998. And then the 12-step group I used to go to had a sobriety definition that said you were sober as long as you did not have sex with yourself or another person outside of marriage. So in other words, if I watched porn or if I had lust in my mind, but I did not act out physically, then I was in the group's eyes, I was sober. Well, I took a business trip, I viewed porn for several hours, but I didn't masturbate, and I came back and I had all that spiritual gunk, all that sewage running through me. And I felt lousy, and met with a guy from the group, great guy, and he said, as I was sharing, he said, well, at least you didn't act out, meaning at least I was still sober. And then all of a sudden the light went on, and I realized that the 12-step program had taken me as far as I wanted to go. When I read scripture, I could not take what God said about sexual purity and what the 12-step program said of sobriety and make them work together. So then at that point I just gave up. I said, God, either you're the God who you say you are, who can change lives, or this whole Christianity thing is a crock. And in that moment, he showed me a picture of my heart. And of course in church you always hear about, there's none righteous, no, not one, and that we're all sinners. But in this moment, God showed me a picture of my heart, and there was nothing good in it. It was all pitch black. There was nothing in there but pride and self-righteousness and lust and anger and greed. And I just broke. And so at that point I decided to start making God's Word the foundation of whatever I needed to do. And I didn't know what I was going to do. But I started looking at God's sobriety definition in Matthew 5, where he says, you have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. That's in Matthew 5. And then when I saw that, I realized that God was saying, as soon as in here I start fantasizing about another woman, that in God's eyes I've sinned, or in man's words, I've lost my sobriety. So when I saw that, I said, this is hopeless, because there's no way I can do that. I can go to support groups, I can be accountable, I can kind of manage the external symptoms for a little while, but this is purity of the heart. This is something totally different than what I've been going after before. So what God was doing at the time was He was showing me what true faith is about. True faith is about learning to really lean on Him hard for everything. And then right after God gives this purity definition, He says, if your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And then He says it again right after that. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. And I realized that in spite of the fact that I had spent the better part of 8 or 9 years looking for recovery, that I had never made a 100% choice to go one way or the other. And God put this in very strict black and white terms. We cannot have lust and we cannot have God. And I was trying to have as much God as I could, but maybe a little bit of lust. And part of the problem was that I wanted the support group to fix me, or I wanted God to take my sin away from me. I wanted Him to just change me so I didn't have to do the work. But really what it came down to is I had to make a hardcore choice once and for all. Like it said here, I'm the one that is responsible, fully responsible for cutting off lust in my life. And I listened to the 12-step groups tell me for years, you're powerless over lust, you're powerless over lust. But when I look at these verses, God's not saying I'm powerless over lust. He's saying I have to take the bull by the horns and blow its brains out. And so, from that point on, I realized that I had a big-time responsibility in the matter. And I had to do whatever it took, and I had to make a hard choice. Either going to go after God 100% or lust 100%, but to quit messing around and kind of dabbling in one and dabbling in another. So at that point I said, no more screwing around, no more compromise, no more playing games, I'm finished. And what cut it off means in practical terms doesn't look the same for everyone else. But for me, it meant when I traveled, which was a big stumbling block for me, that I cannot turn on the TV, because I just start channel surfing, and then eventually I stumble onto the wrong thing. It was just too big and too powerful for me, so I had to stop watching all TV when I travel. The internet wasn't a big problem for me, but TV at home was. So we eventually had all cable turned off in our home. But for some guys, their biggest thing is the internet. And for some of them, that answer is going to be getting a porn blocker. But I will tell you up front, I have never heard of a guy who could not get around a porn blocker when he really wanted to. So if that cutting off action isn't enough, then you're going to have to think hardcore about, okay, what am I going to do so that I cannot access porn? If that means getting rid of the computer, you might have to do that. I know that sounds strict, but if you go and sit there and start talking to Jesus and what He says, you have the responsibility to do what it takes to cut it off. And so I did that, and I also God had some heavy-duty work to do in my heart with forgiving the person who molested me. I had spent years in counseling and processed every feeling and emotion, but one day somebody challenged me and said, have you ever forgiven that person that abused you? And I was like, no, I don't think I have. And the whole process in counseling had been to move through my feelings, and that's part of the healing process, to understand what's been done to you. You can't just stuff your feelings. That's not going to get you anywhere. But the end game is going to be, at some point, I had to forgive the person who had molested me to have any peace and to have that big chip in my shoulder. The other reason I needed to do it was because that was profoundly affecting my marriage, because I had all this anger from what was done to me, and it was messing my marriage up, and it was spilling out into my relationship with my wife. So I wrote the person a letter who had molested me, and just laid out very briefly what they did, and I wrote, "I forgive you." It was a very small letter. That person wrote back and said, "Well, did writing that letter make you feel better?" And in years past, if that person would have said that, I would have gotten angry, but it didn't matter anymore because I had forgiven them. I had released them from it, and when I did that, all the anger was gone, and so I had no control over their response. And what a mistake that a lot of people make, I think, in the church is they think, "I'm going to wait for that person to ask for forgiveness." Well, that day may never come. And the other problem is you cannot base it on what their response is going to be. They may get mad. They may not get defensive. They may never apologize. So it's up to you to forgive if you want to find peace and healing, and no matter what their response is. So God walked me through those things, but I was still empty, and the pull to lust was still strong. This was 6 months after I had broke, and God's doing all this work in my life. He's now my teacher and my counselor. And but that emptiness, that hollow core was still there, and God started bringing me to verses that had to do with seeking God, like 1 Chronicles 16:11, "Seek the Lord in His strength, seek His face continually." Psalm 27:8, when you said, "Seek my face," my heart said to you, "Your face, O Lord, I shall seek." Jeremiah 29:13, "You will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart." And then my favorite, "Sow with a view to righteousness, reap in accordance with kindness, break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the Lord until He comes to rain righteousness on you." And that's Hosea 10:12. And I realized that all my life I had sought freedom from sin, freedom from lust, which is a good thing. I had sought success in business. I had sought, to some extent, love and the approval of others. Sought money and all these other things, but I had never really, and I sought ministry success in the church to be a good Christian, but I never sought God Himself. And so what I did was, I went on this adventure and this quest, and I just started saying, "God, I'm not going to let go until you reveal yourself to me, until I know you, until I have what I'm looking for." And I realized that God was saying that what I was hungry for was Him. I wasn't just after freedom from sin, because I still would have been empty even if the lust was gone. I still would have been empty and miserable even if I was in ministry or doing things for God or successful, because I had done all those things. I wanted the real thing. I just didn't want theology. I didn't want Bible doctrine. I wanted God. I wanted the real thing and the real relationship. And just a few weeks after I started that quest, I was in 1 John 4, reading these verses. "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. The one who does not love does not know God, for God is love. We have come to know and believe the love which God has for us. God is love, and the one who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him." And I just started getting depressed because it talks about abiding in God's love and having that in your heart, and I just knew I was empty and miserable. And in a moment of blatant honesty, I just said, "God, why is it every time I read about your love, every time I read about grace, I get depressed?" And then the Holy Spirit breathed these words right back into my mind immediately. He said, "Because you don't believe it." And then it hit me. The truth dawned in my heart that all my life, all my 36 years of life, I had heard about grace, doctrine, theology. I knew the scripture back and forth, and it was stuck in my head, but it had not gone down to my heart, and I did not believe God's love was for me. I had still been stuck in that pattern from years ago, believing that I could not measure up, that I could not be loved as I was. I was always striving to earn God's love. I did ministry to be approved by Him. My motives were all wrong because of this, and he revealed to me in that moment that he was saying, you've been living a lie, or believing in lies all of your life, and I do love you. And when the truth opened in my heart like that, it was like a valve turned, and all this joy flooded in, and peace and love, and then all of a sudden lust and porn meant nothing to me, and because I had the real thing that I really was looking for every time I acted out. Now I had truth living in my heart. I had a real relationship with God. I wasn't just a poser Christian like I had been. And it didn't matter if I was the good Christian anymore. God accepted me as I was and loved me as I was. And so part of my mission isn't just helping people to quote-unquote break free from lust. Part of my goal is really to encourage people to get along with the Lord. Because when you find Him, when I mean find Him, I mean when you have a real relationship with Him, where He's opened your heart up to His love, all the other stuff starts, it doesn't matter as much anymore. And so you can go to church on Sunday, you can go to support groups, but where the real power and the change was when I just started saying, okay, God, show me, speak to me. I'm yours, I'm here to listen. And the most powerful, life-changing moments in my life have been alone with the Lord, just listening to Him and letting Him teach me and change.